Mean like
in terms of the years, the year and a half during the war, or that time.
even before that?
But we're going to start from before that. Yeah.
Before that, okay.
You'll see.
Well, I graduated from radio.
No, wait, we're not ready. Oh, we are speed. I'm sorry. Okay. But we're going to start with name, rank, and unit in the 23rd.
Well, the name I know, that's Al Spike Berry, and my rank was T4, and 23rd Special Troops, Signal Company Special. I remember that.
Excellent. What were you doing before the war?
Well, I was just a high school graduate and college freshman. I enlisted in the service, and of course, my enlistment was called up. So I was just growing up before the war. I was just a teenager, 19, 20, something like that. And went to Fort Snelling, Minnesota, and it was processed there. Went down to Fort Knox, Kentucky, and went to radio school because I had worked part-time at a radio station as a weekend announcer. And so I went to this radio school and graduated. And at graduation time, there's an awful lot of us in that room. I can't remember how many there were, but the fellow said, okay, you've graduated, congratulations. All you people on this side fall out. You people stay here. Well, I was in the fallout side, and we went outside, and he said, you people get ready to pull out. We're going to take you to Camp Forest, Tennessee. So we got on a train the next day and went to Camp Forest, Tennessee, which was empty. There wasn't anybody there. 82nd Airborne had left. And in there was a couple of empty barracks that were prepared for us and some officers. And we were all radio men, and we had about 600 of us. And they had interviews to select what turned out to be 288 radio operators. And I luckily was interviewed by Fred Fox. And I had 2 interviews, and I was one of the lucky 288, I guess. And from there we went to New Jersey to Fort Monmouth or something, and then we shipped overseas. And that took me to England, and of course eventually to the continent.
What was the interview with Fred Fox like? What do you remember?
Oh, well, anything with Fred Fox is delightful. I was bewildered, and I was just a young kid. I mean, I was all this Army stuff, but he found out I'd been a broadcaster, and he used to work part-time for Mutual Broadcasting System. So we had that in common, sort of. And we hit it off real well, and he had me back for a second interview. And second one was real short, and he just said, we got to take you, Barry, and you're going to be part of the 23rd Special Troops, which I didn't know what that was. And that was just that was my first exposure to Fred Fox. That wasn't the last, but the first.
And what, in your words, was the mission of the 23rd?
Well, our main mission was deception. You learn those things as you go along in the outfit. A lot of this is Fred Fox's philosophy, but the Germans had a very structured command, very brittle, and they had a very low opinion of the intelligence of the American soldier. They thought we were a bunch of cowboys, and we had to play dumb, and we gave them a lot of false information. But the mission of the 23rd Special Troops was deception and to save lives. And you know, in one of the books that had been written, they estimated that we saved between 15 and 30,000 lives with our maneuvers. But you know, even if we'd only saved 15 or 30, it was worth it.
What was the radio part of that deception?
Radio was the stage setter. Now, when you think of the 23rd Special Troops, you think of the inflatable tank or the sound guys, and they're great. But they have to have a stage on which to perform. And we provided that stage because radio is awfully easy on the eyes, you know. And we painted a picture in the German intelligence high definition screen in their mind as what was going on. And our radio operation, the little that I was with it, and I'll get to that later, I guess, but we were good at convoys. If the 4th Armored Division was going to move from point A north to point B, say 100 miles away, we would either be embedded or monitor the radio signals and method of the 4th Armored. They all had little quirks. They all had their system. Like the 4th Armored would go dit, 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 dit. That'd be 4. Real big deal, but it was their identifier. And so we would send some of our fellows into town to the bakery or the coffee shop or bar saying, well, we're moving out tonight. We're moving north. And of course, there were collaborators in all these little villages because they had family in prison that they had to protect. And so what we would do is string out maybe 8 or 9 radio trucks. And we would have checkpoints. It just like if I was checkpoint 1, I'd radio convoy number 1, 4th Armored going by, either by voice or in code, which is easy to break. And then we just kept moving them along, fictitiously, up to the north. And in the meantime, the 4th Armored Division is moving east under the radio silence and at night. But here we had set up a fictitious camp for this 4th Armored. Well, that's when the dog and pony show starts, because that's where the sound comes in, and that's where the inflatables are used. So by the dawn's early light, when the German reconnaissance planes came over to photograph it, they got a beautiful picture of the 4th Armored North. And so we set the stage for the other guys, but we weren't as well known because we were the silent orchestra underneath the musical on the stage.
Silent, but you also had to do some radio talk and during the convoys and stuff. What were some of the things that you would say that, you know?
Well, it was pretty uniform. We kept checking convoy 2 going by checkpoint 1, convoy 3 going by checkpoint 4, and they would just be timed so that the Germans would figure they just follow this thing right along. Mm-hmm. But
tell me, what was your actual assignment? He's doing a radio voice out there.
my actual assignment?
Yeah, hang on 1 second. Tell me your actual, what were you assigned to do, your given assignment?
Mine was like the rest of the guys. I had a radio truck, and it would hold 4 people, and a radio a transmitter, and I was a T4 in charge of a radio truck. That was my assignment. And I did that, and we had other little things that we'd do. Of course, if we had to go to town to do a number, like wear somebody's fake patch and say we're pulling out, or a little dramatic stuff there. Fred Fox calls those special effects. But basically, my assignment was a radio operator. And I was on several, not a lot, but quite a few missions. Some were small, some were convoy movements. But I always thought the 23rd Signal Company Special was excellent at convoy dramatization. We had them fooled. We had a.
I think that might be Skip assignment. Your assignment.
Yeah. I told you the radio truck thing. Radio is so flexible, and the situation in Europe is so fluid that it was kind of hard to say what you do from one day to the next. It isn't like an infantryman or whatever, but You just never knew what you're going to have the next day. And you know, when we first got to Europe, on the continent, we went there with high hopes of being, you know, what a big deal we were. We finally got together, and I think Fred Fox arranged for 3 tents to be put up in a hedgerow. And we went from one tent to the other, and we were told at one tent about this part of the mission and so on. By the time we got out of tent 3, we finally knew what we were supposed to do overall. Now we had to get jobs. We weren't getting any jobs. And so we were just sitting around waiting for our curtain call, you know. And Fred Fox came around, and I talked to him briefly, and he said, you know, Barry, he said, if we don't get work, we're out like trout. I mean, it's just, we have to get jobs, and or we're going to have to disband the outfit. And he said, we have all this equipment and all these people. And so he decided to do a spot, a little 5-minute presentation. And he wrote it, and he had me voice some of it because I had done a little radio work. And he took that around to the various intelligent planning people and got us some work.
Do you remember at all what the promo was like? Can you recall anything that you said and what way that you said it?
I can't recall the content. It was short. And I remember it was the effect of sound and the deception of the inflatables and the radio that would give life to these things. It was, he didn't want to take a lot of their time because they didn't give him much time. I think the thing was less than 5 minutes. But the content, I don't know. It's probably in the archives someplace.
And do you remember what it was recorded on?
Wire recorder. That was the thing. And the Sonic people had at that time, wire recorders, and they were pretty effective and pretty good. And their speakers were just state of the art. I know today we have all this hi-fi stuff, but for 1942, 43, 44, those were just marvelous speakers.
Do you remember interactions with the Sonic groups at all? Coordinating missions and working with them?
They usually followed us after we set up an imaginary camp, because they would have sounds of the tanks coming in and guys cussing and unloading gas tanks. And the only time I really was with or saw the results of the Sonic group, they had their own mission. General Patton had gone way ahead of his supply lines. This guy was in deep trouble, and he had to have gas for those tanks. They were sitting ducks. That's the only time I ever saw General Patton. He came out of the tent wearing his pearl-handled pistol, and the Sonic group went to a forest area, and I don't think they used their expensive speakers. I think they had cheaper fairground-type speakers. They wired up these speakers in the trees and played the sound of gas cans being unloaded. And they can project that quite a ways. And of course, the Germans just bombed the dickens out of those speakers. In the meantime, gas was being unloaded 10 miles away. But that was my first and only experience right up close to see how those guys were good. They really were. And they fooled the Germans. That was the main thing.
So to go back a little bit, tell me about the first weeks when you first arrived on the continent. You said a little bit about how you had to go from tent to tent,
Mm-hmm.
and then you were given your missions. Do you remember your first mission?
No, I don't remember the first one. The first one was less than memorable because it was not too well done. I wasn't in it, so I stayed behind, and that was Brittany. But then we moved, and then got in more involved in other operations and stuff. But after the tents, we were. It wasn't too long after that we finally got a job. But we'd take anything, to get work. But it was kind of funny that we had to use a Madison Avenue approach to do this sort of thing. But Fred Fox is a Hugh Grant personality, and Madison Avenue runs in his blood, and he's very innovative and creative. And that little presentation he made, I think, saved the day, because I could be washing dishes, if for the Army, if it hadn't been for that getting jobs.
And what was a job like?
A mission.
Can you walk me through just like?
Well, it depends on the mission.
One that you.
Like a convoy, a fake convoy, or sometimes I wasn't on them, but sometimes the fellas be called, just a few radio trucks to go out and pull off a little something or other. But we were the ones that set the stage for a lot of the dog and pony show, because we had to give in the mind of the German intelligence monitor what was happening, and they usually by convoys and troop movements, and it took on different situations, but radio is very fluid and flexible, and we kept pretty busy after we got going.
So someone had to sort of, were there any kind of scripts or anything like
No.
that? No. And I know at this point that you had already kind of started another line of work, actually, while you were looking for work.
Well, yes, that's why I wasn't on a lot of the missions. And Major Raggio had liberated a General Electric 16 millimeter sound projector. And he talked to Fred Fox about it. And in my interview with Fred Fox, I had told him I had been a projectionist at my high school in Jamestown, North Dakota. And so they got 2 and 2, made 4, and they came over and saw me and said, "Would you like to run the projector?" And I said, "Sure." So I got this projector, and I was show movie star guys, because when you're not working, you couldn't mingle with the other Army people. We were off to ourselves. So they had no entertainment whatsoever. And so the mission was to have movies. So I went to the different Corps film depots, and they were less than enthused about my request, because only 1,200 men. And what's this? We never heard of the 23rd Special Troops. So we were unheard of and unwanted, and out there all by ourselves with no film showing our projector. But I finally got a few prints, and you had to return them by 11 o'clock the next day. So Bob Conrad, Lieutenant Conrad, who was in charge of the motor pool, saw to it that I had a Jeep and a driver, and I got those films back at 11 o'clock the next day, wherever it was. I mean, maybe getting up at 3 or 4 in the morning and driving, but we got those films back on time, because we had to be good or we wouldn't get films. And then one day, I was getting more acquainted with these guys, and I noticed on the shelf, I said, "What are all those projectors doing up there on the shelf?" The guy says, "They're dead in the water. Can't use them." I said, "Why?" He said, "Exciter lamps are burned out." Now, an exciter lamp is a small bulb that fits inside the machine that puts a beam of light on the soundtrack. And that's your sound. And without that, you're dead in the water. And they were burning out because the guys were not running the power units correctly. Those are 4-cylinder power units that were on 2-wheel trailer. And they get a surge in power. And that would be okay for the motor and the projection lamp. But the exciter lamp was burned out. And it was just about this size. This was just a sample of what it looked like. So I thought, well, that's kind of too bad. So I went back to after the show, and I wrote a letter to General Electric. I got the address out of the nameplate in the projector, just wrote it to General Electric, whatever park it was, New York, and said, we can't get them from supply. Send me some, I'll pay you for them. And about a month later, I get this package, a little egg crate, a little, of about 8 exciter lamps, free from General Electric. And so I had those. I had the power of those lights, and with those little exciter lamps from GE, I got some very good films because they needed those for their projector. They didn't know how I ever got them, and I didn't tell them. I just said, we're a secret outfit. That's a secret. So we had those and got some good films, and I got more popular all the time. And we had the Blarney Theater. And I had an assistant that ran that power unit because we didn't want to burn out our exciter lamps. And you had to have a steady. We had to have our own power because in the continent you didn't. Well, you're in the middle of the forest anyway, so that was my other job, and it turned out to be a little bigger job than I had really thought it was going to be. And I got to be quite well known in the film depots in Central Europe, and after the war, we had to do something before we got shipped back to the States, and we were in charge of taking care of displaced persons. And so in the back of my radio truck, I put that projector and shot the film from the truck, backed it up, and formed a picture on a white barn in Germany or wherever I was. I can't remember now, but we showed that movie, Meet Me in St. Louis, to displaced persons. And we had a Polish interpreter telling them what was happening in the movie. There wasn't much. Judy Garland was singing all the time. They loved the color and the music and the fact they were liberated anyway. And that was really a thrill to show that picture to these displaced persons. They loved the movie. And I got, with my lamp, with my exciter lamps, I got some good prints, and Meet Me in St. Louis is one of my most popular ones. And I own that film.
I wonder if showing the film actually made the situation maybe a little tiny bit better, because from what I understand, the situation was a little tense at the DP camps.
Well, they weren't too tense when I was there because they were liberated and they were being treated decently, and I showed it to some Polish prisoners that were liberated. And I took it right into the camp and showed it to them there. And the captain who was in charge of the Polish fellas maintained military discipline even as prisoners. So the captain, as a gesture of thanks, had me come into his tent or barracks or wherever it was, and I had a glass of Moselle River wine. I remember that, and that was his thank you for showing the film. But things weren't too tense there. They're pretty loose and pretty well handled. And the movies helped keep them entertained, and we had all kinds of people see that movie. It was amazing.
Since we're at the DP camp, was there anything else going on there? Did the signal company also guard them? Were you in charge of guarding them?
I don't think so. Of course, the inflatable guys, the 603rd and the sound people, their stuff was so sensitive and so classified that when the thing was over, they bundled that stuff right up and got it ready for shipment right back to America. And we were in the first 10% to go back to the States. We landed in Norfolk, Virginia on July 3rd or something, and got 30 days leave. And after that was August, and then the VJ Day was upon us. So I always said that Harry Truman saved my life, because if we had had the 23rd Special Troops, which was being expanded, for the October invasion of Japan. I don't know how that would have worked because Japan ain't the continent, that's for sure, and all these islands. And I figured they'd be a little harder to fool also. And I didn't think I wasn't too excited about going to Japan. Luckily, I didn't have to, but I think the Blarney Theater was the only thing I remember with displaced person. We might have done some guarding or hall supplies or something, but I don't think so.
Tell me a little bit more about the Blarney Theater.
Well, that's what I called my movie
That's what you
thing.
call it.
And whenever the troops moved, why we moved with them and set up, and I would get the films, and Morrison E. Moorfield, my assistant, would keep that motor in good shape. And I never kept track of how many films we showed or what their titles were, but I wasn't even thinking about that. But I should have kept a record. But
let's go to a few of the other things that I have. So I'm just going to go back to a few other things. You mentioned something about when you were sent to be with another unit, when you were learning the unit, and some unusual things happened when you would be sent to be embedded, didn't they?
yeah, we called it infiltrating at that time. And once in a while, we would be sent into a headquarters or radio thing, and we would have no patches, usually a new shirt, and would be replacements. So the people in the radio, whatever, thought we were just replacements being sent in. And that happened to me one time. I went in, and we were to watch the way they operated and learn their system. And I'm not sure why we did it in person, but we did. And I went in there, and I was on KP right away. And you have to play the game, you know. And then afterwards, I'd go to the Radio Shack, and they were pretty well embedded where they were, and they were going to be moving out. So we took over in their location when they moved out that night, and that was my only experience with it, being embedded. But and most of it was in KP.
Why did they put you on KP?
I was a recruit. I knew anybody knew got KP, and they couldn't be told that we were radio deception people, 23rd Special Troops. I was just Alfred G. Berry, private replacement, and you had to play dumb, and I was.
So there was some.
You were asking for copies of that. Okay, exactly.
So when you would put on the fake patches and go into town, what were the kind of things that you would do and say, maybe?
Not only the patches, but we had to repaint our bumper. You'd OD it out, paint it out, and then have a stencil and put the, like, 4th Armored. And we go into town, and I was in what they call special effects a couple of times, and we'd go into a bar and say, let's have a drink for everybody here, because, tonight we're, keep it quiet, we're going out tonight, And it was just amazing how fast it got to Berlin. But I remember the one time we pulled this thing off, and in a couple of hours, Axel Sally had it on the air that we want to say goodbye to the whatever division because we know you're moving tonight or something. And I just was amazed that the collaborators they had were forced collaborators. I don't mean to say the French were disloyal, but you got your brother or sister in a prison camp, you tote the mark or their toast. And so, but it was an excellent tool for deception. It really was. And that was a Fred Fox innovation, I think. He called it special effects.
And how did he present it to you guys? What way would he?
Well, he'd get us in a huddle and just go over this with us and say, this is what's going to happen, and this is what we want you to say, and just be natural, and do this and do that. A lot of the guys went to the bakery, got rolls and stuff, and said, we got to get an extra supply because we're moving out tonight, that kind of thing. Fred Fox was a Madison Avenue Broadway play type guy. He knew how to get them to, and he got kids to do stuff that was, they were amazingly good. And there was one company, an engineer company, that was assigned to protecting this very expensive equipment we had. And they did a lot of the work too. They didn't get much credit, but they were some of our special effects guys. But those rubber tanks and those speakers, they were really top of the line, I'll tell you. They were, and they had to be protected. And when they put them up, had them in like the tanks, they had to have somebody watching them because if they sprung a leak, you'd have to get somebody there right away to repair it. And we had a few of our tanks kind of deflate on us in a kind of embarrassing way, but it was like you said previously that saw these 4 GIs carrying this tank, much to the surprise of the locals. You had to be careful of that because you didn't want them to know it was fake. But from the air and from 200 or 300 feet away, they really looked real. I didn't care for the personnel. They had some inflatable people. So. The artillery piece was good. The Jeep was good. But that M4 tank, that was the beauty. That was a piece of work. It really was.
It looked very real.
It really did, yeah.
So with Fred Fox, I mean, he had to do a lot of work to encourage people, to get people excited about this, because at first people didn't really maybe know what to do, and so he had to really kind of guide this thing like a production manager or
Yep.
something.
He was a hands-on implementer of what they had in mind, and you have all the theories you want, but it takes somebody to get the guys to get rolling. And the radio department, for a fake convoy, that was pretty easy to do. Other radio operators did other radio transmission work and so on, but I do remember the convoys is one thing I remember we did the best. That was probably a Fred Fox innovation because he was pretty good at that deception role.
He just thought constantly about what ways things would look to.
Yeah, right. He had a good grip on what he thought the Germans wanted to hear, and we tried to keep him entertained. That's for sure.
And also, there was maybe an idea that the Germans didn't really think too highly of American intelligence.
Oh no, it was a given that the Americans were all stupid, no question about that. And the thing that was also in their disfavor was the fact that their command and control was very brittle. I mean, a private in the German army couldn't do anything on his own. He had to get permission to do it, whether it's to retreat or attack or get shot or whatever. Americans were more like the Fred Fox type, go with the flow. But because they were so brittle, it was to our advantage because they would be confused and would panic because they wouldn't know where the 4th Armored was. They thought it was up north, and then they find out it's south, and they didn't know what to do. And they had to have a higher command tell them what to do. Just like on the invasion of Europe. They thought the Pas-de-Calais was the area where they were going to come in. And we made them think so. With increased radio traffic, General Patton was to be in charge of it, and they were pretty convinced that it was going to be up there. And when they found out it wasn't, they still didn't believe that it wasn't going to be there. So they were confused then from the very beginning. But the 23rd Special Troops had nothing to do with the Pas-de-Calais. Fred Fox had a little to do with it, but that was the first time radio was used to fool the Germans, I think, in Europe. But we were still at Walton Hall then, waiting to land on the continent.
There were a couple of stories that you told me about. One was about liberating some caches of liquor.
Oh, yeah.
Can you
We were in northern France, and the Germans had been smuggling wine, Omar Benedictine, and cognac and Calvados out of Paris. And they have a depot halfway between Berlin and Paris. And it was camouflaged and hidden. And we just, I don't know how we liberated that, but we stumbled across this. And there was, my word, all kinds of wine. And so as a result of this liberation, we all got 3 bottles of booze. And Stanley B. Nance, who you probably have interviewed, was not of the drinking type. And so he gave me his supply. And he's been a friend for life. And we all liberated that very nicely. We saved the Germans a lot of work by taking care of it. The Calvados, if you're familiar with that, is an apple, Everclear kind of, and I used it for my cigarette lighter. I didn't drink it.
So you mentioned Stanley. What was Stanley like during the war?
Stanley Nance? Stanley Nance is a very astute and disciplined, knowledgeable operator. He was called upon for many things that I didn't even know anything about. He had a radio truck, and he did his job, and very systematic, and he kept records, and he was much better than me. I was too busy running around getting movies, but I would see him from time to time, and I knew him well enough for him to give me his booze, but he was an excellent operator. Yeah, very dependable, and he could figure things out. He was very good. All of our guys were pretty good, though. They really were. For kids, we were only 19, 20, 21 years old. We started picking up that mission pretty well. And I can't say that anybody was bad. They're all, but Stanley Nance is exceptional.
And what kind of people were leading the signal company special at that time? Who were the brains behind the thing?
Well, I never knew who the brains were behind it. Captain Vanderhyde was our company commander, and we had other lieutenants, and also attached was Lieutenant Conrad, in charge of the motor pool and the message center. And I guess Vanderhyde would be the implementer, but always behind every operation was a touch of Fred Fox. And I think Vanderhyde kind of would depend on Fred to kind of help a little bit in figuring out who's going to do what when. But I think that Captain Vanderhyde was probably the director of record, but Fox was the assistant, that's for sure.
We'll go back to missions a little bit. What do you recall about crossing the Rhine, about the Rhine operation?
I was in on that, and I don't know too much about it. It was our biggest and best, I think. And I know there was no movie that night because they said, Barry, you're going out. And so I took my radio truck, and the radio guys performed as I recall it, we had a fake convoy, and we moved this unit down south on the Rhine and went across on the north, or I can't remember exactly what happened, but that was our best operation. And I just had a small part of that, but I was in on it, and it was a radio, sonic, inflatable thing. It was just, it was the whole 9 yards. That was our final our final curtain call, as I recall, not much after that, because I could find out what happened by reading the book. Like Bill Blass said, we finally find out what happened by reading these books that had been published. But that was a big operation, and I wish I knew more about it. But
So speaking about not knowing much about it, you said that the 23rd was unheard of and unwanted. Why?
well, first of all, we were non-existent. Even where we were was classified, and my experience, of course, was with mail. We finally got mail, but it was sometimes they couldn't. Nobody knew where the 23rd Special Troops were, and then also like getting film. They wanted to know how many people you're going to show to, because the films were limited. And if I would say, well, I show it to about 300 guys a night, well, and we have a division that's going to show it to 1,000, well, it's you're kind of at the end of the list there. But I finally got that overcome with these exciter lamps. But it was just unknown. That's all. It wasn't nobody didn't like us, but they didn't know us well enough to like us because they didn't know who we were. And to this day, there's people don't know. I mean, in the Army records, sometimes there's not the 23rd mention. I mean, we're just kind of non-existent. And like releasing this information that we have in this program, Fred Fox, who worked for President Eisenhower, tried to get that information released when Eisenhower was in the presidency, and he had a pretty good in, but it couldn't be released. It was not released, and so they had to wait until now for it to be told. But that's so you can imagine why they wouldn't know who we were in Europe if they didn't know who we were in the States. But we're getting known now, but it's a few years later.
Was there a lot of secrecy imposed on you at the time? During the operations, during the war?
Oh, yes. I mean, we knew that if things went wrong, if we have a bunch of dummy tanks and Germans attack it, that's not too good, you know. So we had to be very careful about. That's why we were separated from the rest of the American troops, we used to call them, because, you know, guys start talking about what do you do and where are you located and how many guys are in your outfit and where have you been, and well, we couldn't intermingle with the rest of go to the USO or because it just wasn't part. We were in like a priesthood in a nunnery area, you know, like. In fact, we were in a seminary in Luxembourg, and we had to keep away from the rest of the American troops, we called them. It was pretty secret.
How did you feel about that? I mean, what were your feelings?
Didn't bother me. It was part of the mission. That was, you know, it's, and that's why I thought the movies were so important, and they really were, much more than a person would think. But the fact that fellows could go to a show at night and not have to just sit around and write letters home was a little bit of a morale booster. It really was. And the Blarney Theater got more popular all the time.
Mm-hmm. You had a strange thing happen to you when you were in Worcester, didn't you?
Yes.
After the war?
Strange is the word for it. Captain Vanderhyde was a gentle, fatherly type guy. Now, he wasn't much older than we were, but, you know, anybody 30 years old was old at that time because I was 19 or 20. But our congregational minister from Jamestown, North Dakota, had been transferred to Worcester, Mass. And so my mother had told me in a letter that Reverend Thomas was in Worcester, Massachusetts, and so I went to see Captain Vanderhyde, who was easy to see, and asked me if I could have a pass to go to Worcester to visit my minister. And he said, sure. So I got this pass, took the train to Worcester, and stayed overnight. And the next morning, of course, he gets the paper. On his front door was this paper, the Worcester Telegram. And on the front page was this feature story, Ghost Army fools the foe in the neatest trick of the war. And I just couldn't believe all the secrecy we had. And they had this on the front page of the Worcester Telegram. Well, we had breakfast. I excused myself and asked the Reverend Thomas if we could go downtown. I wanted to buy a couple of papers. And I went to one place and bought all the papers they had, which is 6. And I went to another place. There were 2 papers there. The other papers, they'd pulled the story. And that was the fact that this chap had told his reporter friend about our outfit. And when the war was over, the Office of War Information closed down almost immediately after Japan surrendered, just a day or 2 afterwards. So the War Information Office had rejected this fellow's story as top secret. And he followed the rules. He sent it in. They rejected it. He had it published, had it printed and ready to go, but there was nobody to say no anymore. The office had closed. So it wasn't all his fault, and he published it in the paper. But the fault was that this chap had given the information to his reporter friend when he shouldn't have. That was the no-no part of it. And that was the unusual thing. And so when I went back to Pine Camp, I could have sold those papers for $10 a piece, but I had about 10 of them, and they're well circulated now. Many copies made. But that was just happened to be at the right time at the wrong time or whatever. But that was an interesting. And of course, Reverend Thomas wondered why I was getting these papers. And I said, well, I want some souvenirs of Worcester, Mass. So.
Did you ever think, what would you think of when you would think of what you guys were doing, what the 23rd was doing? Would it seem strange to you, or did it seem?
I never thought in my wildest dreams I'd be lucky enough to be in an outfit like that. 1,200 men. Some pretty good guys. I could learn a lot from them. I'm just a North Dakota farm boy, and here I am with these 1,200 people. And we always had a fear that we'd be found out. And we also had a rumor one time that the Germans had a dummy outfit. And that was a little concern to us because that fooling people can work both ways. And one time, it was not true, but at one time the rumor was that both dummy outfits were facing each other. But that wasn't true. That was a rumor. But you always had the feeling that if somebody figures this thing out, it could be bad news Charlie, because we were skirting, danger a little bit, and it was just life and limb, really. That I didn't want to get shot.
Were you in any close situations?
Only one time. We, the lieutenant, who I won't mention, we had a little convoy of some kind doing something. We were moving to another location. He didn't read his map right, and he drove us almost right into the German front lines, and we quickly got out of there. But we lost a couple of fellas with artillery fire, Captain Wells, George Peddle, but we were pretty much back of a little out of artillery range anyway. But to answer your question, I'm not sure that I got it right.
No, you did.
Yeah.
And what happened when the war was over? Do you remember the day that you heard it was over?
The day that the war was over, I went from, I was in Trier, I think. And VE Day came upon us. It was announced, we had it, of course, on radio. And I went right back to Luxembourg, which is one of my favorite places in the whole world, and celebrated there. And there was a lot of celebrating going on, that's for sure. And yeah, I got out of Trier and went back to. We'd taken over a Catholic seminary for the 23rd Special Troops, and so I got to know Luxembourg reasonably well, and so that was the place to go to celebrate because everybody was pretty happy about it, as you can tell. But that's what I did. I went right back to Luxembourg.
And what are your strongest memories of the war, time during the war?
Strongest memories.
Or the most vivid memories, or the things that.
Well, I think graduating from radio school was important. Being selected by the Captain Fox to go with the 23rd Special Troops and finding out what we were going to do, because I had no idea we were going to be doing what we did when I was being interviewed by him. He didn't tell us anything. He couldn't. Just wanted to know if we were qualified. And you know, they had a good system to pick out the guys. And as you could tell from the artists and so on that were in there, the joke, of course, is that with the Army personnel, if you graduated from Baker College, you were in the kitchen. But not this case. They were pretty precise. And they also, I went back the second time, and there was a few days gap there. I didn't know it until later, but they had interviewed my mother in Jamestown. Just briefly, some FBI guy or whatever, I don't know what it was, but I was an adopted child, and my real parents were German-Russian. And they were a little sensitive about that because they thought I might have had German relatives or German loyalties. And my foster mother reassured them that I was an American true and blue, and it was okay. But I was surprised they were that thorough, but they were, and I passed, and that was an important highlight for me. And of course, Walton Hall and England, that's a special place in the whole world. And then, of course, the landing and then our eventual victory. And, of course, the exciter lamps.
Can we pause tape for a bit?
Why, sure we can.
I have, I feel like you have given me all the answers.
Whenever you're ready.
Were there, in the signal unit, were there people, a lot of people, enlisted men or officers who were involved, sort of as you were, in radio or telephone communications before the war?
Captain Vanderhyde was a employee or supervisor for Southwestern Bell in California, as I recall. I don't know of any guys that were in broadcast radio in our outfit. I'm trying to think. I really don't think so. Just Captain Vanderhyde and I may think of somebody later, but
You can send me a telegram.
yeah.
So, tell me about Captain Vanderhyde.
Well, he's a very even, older chap and very fair. Seemed to enjoy what he was doing, and liked the signal company special, and he was very likable. He was very pleasant. He wasn't a strict, shine your shoes kind of guy. He was more like Southwestern Bell, you know. And he was very, very understanding. And I remember I asked him for that pass to go to Worcester, Mass. And also, 4 of us got permission from him to go to Philadelphia to visit the parents of George Peddle, who had been killed. And he allowed us to do that. He was very sympathetic that way. Nice guy.
You've talked a lot about Fred Fox, and I want you to if I knew nothing about Fred Fox, for somebody watching who knows nothing about Fred Fox, tell me a little bit about him and what he's like and why he's important to this unit.
Well, he had kind of a Hugh Grant personality, like I said. And he wasn't as handsome as Hugh Grant, but he had that mannerism. He had a sharp mind. And he never put anybody down. He always gave you credit for, encouraged you to do whatever. And he was very innovative. He had a touch of Madison Avenue in him. And I can't describe him any better than that, I guess, but I always thought he was the on-the-ground, hands-on implementer of the overall mission for the signal or camoufleurs or the sound. He used to be involved in the Princeton, the Princeton Theater or Princeton, what do they call it?
I can't remember that.
Anyway, well, he was with the Princeton Broadway shows, and he was showbiz. He really was. And
Well, he seemed to bring a touch of showmanship.
oh yes, absolutely. He was showbiz. He made the job interesting and challenging, and it got results. He was a very, very important guy, I thought. The others were important too, but we saw more of him because he was more hands-on. As I say, I was busy running around doing other things, but everybody that you talk to in this program, I'm sure, have the same opinion that.
And
So you can look at me.
Okay,
Now, from the beginning, you
close call. You asked about a close call. The only one I remember was I was doing the Blarney Theater bit. We were stationed in Luxembourg, and I was going to return this film, which I always did at 11 o'clock every day. And I went into this town, and I always stopped at a bakery, got some rolls, take back to the guys. And the bakery was closed. And I went down the block where 8th Corps was, I think it was 8th Corps. Film library was closed, gone, nobody there. I thought, well, hello, what's going on here? And so I went to the middle of the town, a little square, and there was an MP there. And I said, what's going on here? He said, what the hell are you doing here? And I said, I'm returning a movie film. He said, you're returning what? I said, I'm returning a movie film. He said, listen, sir. He said, you get that Thompson submachine gun that's in your leather holster along your spare tire, put oil on it and get it running and shoot it get it operational, and then you and your driver get the hell out of town. And so we left Bastogne, I would imagine at least a half hour before it fell or was surrounded. And we went back to where you had the picture earlier of the snowfall, and it was winter weather. It was terrible. And we got there, and I got the film back to 8th Corps or whatever it was. They thought I was crazy, but they want the film at 11 o'clock. They got it at 11 o'clock. But that was my closest call. And Captain Vanderhyde, I told you what a family sort of, he was a father to us guys. And he became very concerned about the situation and knew that I had gone to Bastogne to return this film. And Bastogne was in the news for sure. And he went to where I was staying in the seminary and talked to some of the fellows in my room and said, you better gather up some of Barry's personal effects because I'm not quite sure what this is going to be what's going to happen here, but just be prepared. And so they were, and in the meantime, I was scooting around and got stopped by an Army checkpoint because they were really quite nervous. This is a bad time, and the Germans had captured Americans and taken their uniforms. Those who could speak English were posing as checkpoint operators. They have you stop and then they shoot you, which is unkind. And so I luckily caught an American checkpoint and told them who I was. And well, they didn't know the 23rd Special Troops were a load of hay, but I said I was the 12th Army Group, and I said, don't ask me any questions about baseball. I don't know anything about baseball, except that the Brooklyn Dodgers play in Brooklyn. And he said, go ahead. So I got back to Luxembourg, or that area, back to I think it was Liège or something, where the pictures you had of the artist sketching in the snowfall. That was a bad time. It really was. Bad weather, bad tactical, and we weren't doing too well at that particular time. So I was glad to get out of there. That's for sure. That was my close call.
Thank you. That was a good one. I mean, that you survived, especially.
Yes, it was.
That must have been pretty horrible hearing that when you got back, that they had wanted to collect your belongings just in case. I think that.
Well, then I just wanted to prepare the guys because the Germans were pretty aggressive, that's to say the least. There was is the camera not going now?
The camera is going.
Oh, it is going.
Go ahead.
There was a rumor, and this is, I thought this is just between us, but there was a rumor that one of our movements, fake movements, had triggered the Germans to attack, but I don't think that was true because they had planned that Battle of the Bulge well in advance, but we had done some missions around there, and it might have, you never know, but as it turned out, we won the war anyway, so I guess.
There you go.
You didn't lose the war first either.
The end.
Well,
That's the end of my close calls.